Before birth control, pregnancy still wasn't always wanted. Ancient humans knew this problem very well. They just didn't have modern medicine, no pharmacies, no hormonal pills, no modern condoms, and definitely no pregnancy apps. Yet people still tried avoiding pregnancy, sometimes intentionally, sometimes with surprisingly clever methods, and sometimes with absolutely terrible ones. Because ancient birth control was complicated, some methods probably worked somewhat, others were mostly wishful thinking. So how did they actually try? The first method was incredibly simple: avoid sex during certain periods. Sounds obvious, right? But understanding fertility wasn't easy. Ancient people didn't know about ovulation, they didn't know about sperm, they couldn't see reproductive cells, but they could observe patterns. Menstruation was impossible to ignore. Women noticed their cycles, and some recognized recurring patterns. Certain days seemed different, but cycle timing varies between women. So this method was unreliable. Still, observation was one important tool. Another method required no plants, no potions, no strange ingredients. It was simply abstinence. Avoiding sex meant avoiding pregnancy. The biology behind that never changed. But humans aren't exactly famous for restraint, so people searched for other solutions. One method involved timing, another involved withdrawal. The basic idea was straightforward. The man withdrew before ejaculation. Ancient societies knew this technique. It required careful timing, and it was far from foolproof. Still, people used it because they had limited alternatives. Then things get much stranger. Ancient people experimented with substances. Some were inserted into the vagina, others were swallowed, and some were applied externally. The goal was always similar: stop sperm from reaching the egg. They didn't understand that mechanism, but they knew pregnancy followed sex. That connection was obvious. The mystery was everything happening afterward. And that's where ancient medicine gets fascinating, because some recipes were surprisingly specific. Ancient Egyptian medical texts mention contraception. Some recipes used acacia. Others included honey, and mixtures were sometimes placed vaginally. The reasoning wasn't completely random. Some mixtures could create physical barriers. Acacia may have produced lactic acid. That could affect sperm survival. But ancient users didn't know this chemistry. They only knew what seemed useful, and effectiveness was probably inconsistent. Then comes one famous ancient contraceptive, a plant called silphium. Ancient Romans and Greeks prized it. It was used for many purposes, but contraception became one famous use. Silphium became incredibly valuable. So valuable it was commercially harvested. Ancient coins even depicted the plant. Some researchers connect it with contraception, but here's the important warning: we don't know exactly how effective it was. Historical evidence is incomplete. Modern claims often exaggerate its effectiveness. So don't imagine ancient miracle birth control. It probably wasn't that simple. And then there were stranger recipes. Some involved herbs and animal products. Others used mixtures we would avoid today. Some could actually be dangerous. Ancient medicine lacked modern safety testing. Nobody ran controlled clinical trials. Nobody checked long-term toxicity. A remedy could spread through tradition, even without actually working. That brings us to another strategy. Breastfeeding could delay fertility. This happens through lactational amenorrhea. Frequent breastfeeding can suppress ovulation. Ancient women certainly experienced this naturally, but it wasn't a guaranteed method. Ovulation could return unexpectedly, especially when breastfeeding patterns changed. Still, breastfeeding often spaced births. And that mattered enormously, because pregnancy wasn't always the only concern. Raising children required tremendous resources. Food had to be found. Children needed years of care. Another baby could change everything. So birth spacing had major advantages, and ancient communities likely recognized this. Then there's something people often overlook. Pregnancy wasn't always actively prevented. In many ancient societies, large families were valuable. More children meant more helping hands, but that depended on culture. Not everyone wanted the same family size. And that distinction matters. Ancient people weren't simply trying to maximize births, they made reproductive choices too. Sometimes those choices were successful, sometimes they weren't. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Ancient contraception was generally unreliable. Failure could completely change someone's life. There were no pregnancy tests, no ultrasound scans, no emergency contraception, and no modern abortion medication. Pregnancy became obvious through physical changes. Then the community had to adapt. But ancient societies also knew another trick. They sometimes used physical barriers. Historical sources describe various sheaths. Some were made from animal materials. These weren't modern condoms. Their purpose could still be similar, creating a barrier during intercourse. But evidence varies across cultures, and historical descriptions aren't always clear. So we shouldn't overstate their use. The bigger picture is more interesting. Humans repeatedly experimented with fertility control across different civilizations, across different continents, across thousands of years. The methods changed, but the problem remained remarkably familiar. People wanted control over when children arrived, sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes for health reasons, sometimes simply for personal choice. And sometimes they had no choice. That's another important part of history. Not everyone had equal control. Social rules shaped reproductive decisions. Marriage customs shaped them too. So did religion and law. Ancient contraception wasn't just medicine. It was part of society. And sometimes it was deeply risky. Some herbal remedies could poison people, others could cause serious injuries. Ancient medical knowledge had limits, but that doesn't mean they knew nothing. They observed bodies carefully, they noticed recurring patterns, they tested traditional remedies, and passed successful ideas forward. Some methods probably helped, others probably did almost nothing. And some made things worse. So the real answer isn't one method. Ancient humans used many strategies: abstinence, withdrawal, breastfeeding, plant-based preparations, timing and fertility awareness, and occasionally physical barriers. None matched modern contraception reliably, but their goal was surprisingly familiar. They wanted more control over reproduction. They wanted to choose timing. They wanted to space births, and sometimes avoid pregnancy entirely. The biggest difference was their technology. They were working with observation, tradition, plants, and trial and error. Today, contraception can be far more reliable, but the human question hasn't changed. When should we have children, and when should we wait? Thousands of years ago, humans were already asking the same question. They simply had very different answers.